For decades, a slab of concrete has sat like a blank face on a Bavarian slope, a smooth, gray answer to a violent question. No tourist route leads to it, no plaque explains the precise cruelty that gave it reason to exist. The world walked past it, as it passed many such places after 1945, sealed, catalogued, and often forgotten. But one man kept returning. He drove the same narrow roads, opened the same official folders, measured the same cracks, and stood above those sealed mouths of rock and steel. He is Heinz Raby, a government-designated geologist, and the unlikely, solitary link between the present and the cavernous industrial ambitions of the Third Reich. The concrete says, closed. He keeps the key to the closure, and the obligation to know what lies beneath. The seal is an image that answers a question before words do. A mountain's flank interrupted by a perfect oval of concrete, a rusting ring where a door once turned, a tiny, careful brass plate with a bureaucratic number. From this distance the site looks inert, neutered, like a wound cauterized and left to the weather. Up close, the textures tell a different truth. Hairline fractures run from the edge of the plug into the sandstone. The slope below shows the slow slide of soil. The metal ring is pitted by decades of frost and acid rain. These are not relics of a completed project. They are the aftermath of something that never fully came alive, and yet required entire landscapes to be turned inside out to attempt. In the decades after the war, many such subterranean projects were left as problems to be solved rather than stories to be told. The Allies inspected, salvaged what they could, and sealed what remained dangerous or politically inconvenient. In towns from Oberammergau to Neckarzimmern, from Kalle to the North Sea bunkers, the shells of plans stood like bones with the soft tissue removed. The history that follows is both a technical inventory and an ethical ledger, a record of ambitious engineering and of the human cost it exacted. It is a story best told on two registers at once, the cold facts of machines and plans, and the warmer, more devastating testimony of the people who dug, toiled, and died to build them. If you want the whole story of these forgotten factories and the people who worked and died in them, subscribe and stay with this series. The Nazi leadership by 1943 faced a strategic problem that seemed simple and terrible. The Allied air war was destroying the Reich's surface industry. Factories were vulnerable. Rail lines, ports, and assembly plants were exposed to raids that increasingly paralyzed production. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, proposed a radical solution: bury the industry. Move assembly halls into the earth, into mountains and sand, under the protection of rock and concrete. The calculus was grim and bureaucratic, more protection for output, but at enormous cost in resources, time, and human lives.
Hans Kammler, an SS engineer whose remit grew into the construction of military subterranean works, coordinated massive projects that blurred lines between military urgency and industrial organization. Companies like IG Farben were pressed into service, and scientists and engineers, some later notable for post-war careers, were enlisted for the technical challenge. Plans ranged from pragmatic to fantastical. In the mountains, they envisioned cavernous halls large enough to house assembly lines for the Me-262 jet fighter. In limestone and sandstone, they hoped to carve galleries for V-2 rockets and jigs for their engines. Along the coast, they planned bunkers to shield launch facilities or storage for long-range projects. Some proposals reached for chemical weapons facilities. The Falkenhagen site, intended for sarin production, was one such dark example. Others were part of a literal armory of ideas, concepts like the V3 or the Paris gun variant that stretched engineering imagination into monstrous scale. Records show production targets that, for the moment, should be read with caution. They reflect plans under duress, promises to Hitler's strategic expectations, and the bureaucratic momentum of a war machine that continued to plan as it collapsed. The scale is important because it helps explain the human machinery behind the concrete. At Neckarzimmern, sometimes referenced in period documents as Nickerzimmern, engineers and prisoners cut hundreds of kilometers of galleries. One documented network runs to roughly 34 kilometers in carved sandstone, a distance that equals a small modern highway and anchors the staggering physical effort required. At Kalle, halls intended for Me-262 production were vast and hollowed with the idea of assembly lines running on rails beneath the stone. Mittelbau Dora, perhaps the most notorious of these subterranean production centers, became the principal site for V2 assembly in late 1944 and early 1945. Its galleries sliced into the Harz Mountains, where thousands of forced laborers worked under lethal conditions to assemble the A4 rockets that Wernher von Braun and his team had designed for mobilized war. These were not sterile engineering projects. They were built by people who had been deported, enslaved, and stripped of basic dignity. The labor pool came from concentration camps, from prisoners of war, and from workers coerced from occupied territories. The organization often mixed private industrial interests, SS-run camps, and military demands in a way that intentionally blurred responsibility. Names and papers document the involvement of private firms, the SS's administration of labor, and the state's pressured oversight. The result was a production framework where deadlines were enforced through violence, and where death was an omnipresent byproduct of both neglect and design. Technically, the underground proposals contended with difficult geology, logistics, and a shrinking industrial base.
Sandstone and limestone both offer workability for tunneling, but present different long-term stability challenges. Sandstone, in particular, fractures and delaminates under the vibrations of explosive excavation and under freeze-thaw cycles, making many galleries inherently unstable unless heavily supported. Experts in mining and geotechnical engineering point out that emergency wartime tunneling often prioritized speed and volume over long-term lining or controlled blasting patterns. The result was an architecture that could stand for the short term under pressure, but often degraded quickly without the planned reinforcements that peacetime budgets might have supplied. That's an engineering reason why many post-war inspections found galleries collapsing or threatened by rockfall decades on. The story of a few sites illustrates how plans, geology, and human suffering intersected. Mittelbau Dora sits at the center of this narrative. Originally an underground armory with production galleries carved into the mountain, it transformed under the late war pressure into a primary V2 complex. Halls designed for assembly and testing became grim factories where men worked in conditions that would later be documented by survivors and by liberating soldiers. The rockets themselves, the A4, later known as the V2, were a technical achievement in early rocketry and a moral controversy in equal measure. They used turbopumps and guidance gyros that would inform post-war aerospace development, yet their production rests on a foundation of forced labor and extreme mortality. Wernher von Braun's technical role and the post-war transfer of rocketry expertise to both American and Soviet programs are part of that complicated legacy. Engineers' skills traveled, but so did the moral questions about where technical talent should be situated after it was used within systems of oppression. Kala, farther south, became associated with Me-262 ambitions. The jet represented a leap in fighter speed and potential. Its twin engines promised a degree of tactical surprise. Plans to assemble and finalize jets underground attempted to shield production from Allied air superiority. The halls were designed to give space for jigs, runways, and the logistical choreography modern assembly required. The work was interrupted repeatedly by shortages, bombing, and the chaotic late-war mobilization of labor. Some halls were partially completed, others remained as massive voids in the rock. The visual record in rare color photography, images that survive thanks to the work of photographers like Walter Frentz, shows vast, darkened caverns with skeletal structures, the ghost of a factory that never came to full life. On the northern coasts, places like Watten and Wizerness, La Coupole, represented a different strategic thrust.
Huge concrete domes and bunkers were designed to be launch or storage facilities for rockets and missiles, to serve as fixed installations for specialized weapons programs. The Allied bombing and later inspections revealed that many coastal projects were incomplete, mismanaged, or repurposed. These were manifestly military infrastructure, constructed to survive an anticipated intensification of strategic attacks, but their utility declined as the war's operational logistics and air superiority shifted. Then there is Falkenhagen, a site whose story raises particularly sharp ethical weight. Intended to produce sarin, a deadly nerve agent, the facility's partial construction and the records around it are a reminder that the subterranean program was not only about propulsion and flight. Chemical warfare, planned production lines, and materials that could cause mass casualties were part of the matrix of projects that authorities contemplated moving underground for concealment and protection. The public documentation on such projects is often sparse, and in places redacted or labeled restricted. The cautious presentation here is intentional. Where records are unclear, historians mark the boundary between confirmed fact and indefinito, the things surveillance or time has not plainly revealed. The technical goals of these underground sites varied: to protect production from air attack, to conceal new weapon concepts behind meters of rock, to maintain a war economy that was increasingly vulnerable to surface destruction. But the plans met logistical limits: shortages of skilled labor and materials, Allied interdiction of supply lines, and the accelerated pace of Allied armies on the ground. Many projects never reached the production rates envisioned in the documents. The documents themselves must be read as wartime planning papers, aspirational, sometimes bureaucratically inflated, and often disconnected from the logistical reality of a collapsing war economy. Behind the numbers, behind the blueprints, are the people who were forced to build. Survivors who later spoke about their experiences passed along details that are stark in their ordinary cruelty: 12-hour shifts in poor light, the constant hunger that undermines strength, exposure to cold and damp that produce disease, a rationing of medical care and dignity. Max Mannheimer, who survived Auschwitz and later endured forced labor elsewhere, is one of those whose later testimony has been recorded in interviews and memorial projects. Likewise, Peter Wolf, whose time at Mitlabau Dora put him at the epicenter of the V2 production network, provided testimony that traces daily routines marked by work quotas, brutality, and loss. Their accounts do not need embellishment. The simplest transcriptions of their recollections convey the grinding reality of forced labor.
A typical day for a prisoner assigned to tunneling or assembly could begin before dawn with roll call, followed by a march to the site, a weighed allocation of bread or soup, and then the labor itself: heaving rock, setting charges, moving unfinished components by hand. Blasting created shards of stone that embedded in skin and lung tissue. Inadequate shelter and clothing made cold winters lethal for the weak. The oral histories emphasize not only physical exhaustion, but also the psychological terror, the knowledge that mistakes might be punished, that an inability to meet quota could mean beatings or execution, and that the work itself was part of an industrial chain that fed weapons to a regime bent on extermination. In this sense, the engineering is inseparable from the moral architecture that built it. Allied response after liberation was a mixture of pragmatic salvage, documentation, and at times a desire to sweep troubling infrastructure out of public view. Where possible, machinery and records were removed and repurposed. Where not, many entrances were sealed. Some sites were examined thoroughly by military teams that cataloged equipment and interviewed local witnesses. Others were left partly untouched, sealed because they were structurally dangerous, because their contents were too hazardous, or because post-war priorities favored reconstruction over preservation. In the immediate years after 1945, the question was often one of public safety. An unstable gallery could kill a curious child or an overconfident scavenger. By the 1950s and 1960s, as decades passed, attention shifted again to memory, commemoration, and the difficult politics of whose stories would be told. That political and ethical calculus is one reason the role of a caretaker like Heinz is both technical and symbolic. Heinz was appointed by state authorities, not as a former guard or an ex-official, but as a trained geologist charged with ongoing inspections. His remit is pragmatic: to check seals, measure movement and rock faces, monitor groundwater infiltration that can accelerate decay, and ensure that no unauthorized entry endangers the public. He is also tasked with recording changes, filing reports, and liaising with conservation bodies, municipalities, and occasionally memorial organizations. His work sits at the intersection of hazard mitigation and historical stewardship. The tasks require particular skills. A geologist explains that modern inspections rely on an array of relatively simple but reliable techniques: seismic readings that detect movement within a block of stone, laser profilers that measure wall deformation, and small core sampling in cases where a material analysis is necessary. Importantly, none of these methods involve reckless entry into unstable galleries. Where hollowing or rockfall is suspected, remote methods are prioritized. When in-person checks are necessary, trained teams use harnesses, controlled lighting systems, and protocols for air monitoring that detect dangerous gases or low oxygen levels. Unexploded ordnance remains a real hazard in many locales. Any suspected ordnance is reported to bomb disposal units, and local teams are trained not to touch or move suspicious objects. Even the act of sealing a shaft involves choices with long-term consequences. A concrete plug might stabilize a face in the short term, but if it hides a continuing water table problem or a pressure differential that would produce long-term seepage, the seal can accelerate local deterioration. In some cases, partial openings allow drainage to be maintained. In others, full sealing was the only safe option given limited budgets and the lack of local capacity for monitoring. That is part of why the same sites require periodic review. What was safe in 1947 may not be safe in 1977 or 2007.
The physical dangers protect a broader moral danger, the erasure of history. Looting of industrial equipment, scavenging of rails or metal, and the casual repurposing of tools can strip a site of the artifacts that connect it to the stories that must be remembered. Memorialization, conversely, often requires preserving certain spaces intact, or at least documenting them carefully. For survivors and relatives, a sealed shaft might be both a wound and a memorial, a place where memory is anchored even if the remains are not accessible. Communities and states have balanced, with varying success, the goals of public safety, historical preservation, and economic constraints. Heinz's inspections are therefore not merely technical checklists, they are acts of custodianship. He logs movement in millimeters, notes the presence of water stains like a physician noting a fever, and files reports that may later serve historians, engineers, or courts. He also sometimes enables sanctioned visits by survivors or by delegations of scholars. When ex-inmates request to see the places where they labored, authorities rarely allow unsupervised access. Instead, supervised, carefully planned visits by groups with protection and medical support are arranged. Those visits are part of the living memory of the sites, evidence that the geography of cruelty persists not only in documents, but in footsteps and returned faces. There is also a bureaucratic backbone to his position. State agencies assign responsibility for these sites not out of sentimentality, but from legal obligations and public safety concerns. In some regions, the assignment is explicit. A named geologist must account annually for dozens of former military industrial sites. In other cases, responsibilities are distributed across municipal authorities, conservation agencies, and national archives. This allocation of duty informs the way a person like Heinz spends decades of his professional life.
He is not a solitary romantic guardian in the sense of a loner clinging to a past he remembers personally. He is an appointed steward, carrying out an institutional mandate that also intersects with his personal sense of conscience and a local culture of remembrance. The present-day reality beneath the slopes is complex. Many galleries remain in a precarious balance with the rock that surrounds them. In parts, unlined chambers have collapsed inward, producing spoil heaps and sinkholes visible to passers-by. In others, concrete and steelwork intended to stabilize cavities has corroded, losing strength incrementally. Unexploded ordnance, sometimes the size of a small car component or a shell casing, hides among rubble and requires ordnance disposal specialists. The long half-life of industrial contamination, oils, solvents, and in some cases residues of chemical precursors means that environmental monitoring is part of the maintenance brief. These are not romantic relics preserved for posterity. They are sites that present ongoing risks to people and to the environment. Survivor visits and memorial ceremonies complicate the site status further. Where a community decides to permit memorial access, an additional layer of infrastructure, signage, fencing, guided paths, and interpretive material must be added. Local governments and memorial foundations sometimes fund such projects, but funding is uneven. In small towns, municipal treasuries are thin, and the pressure to repurpose land or ignore the costs of conservation is constant. This practical tension informs why some sites remain inert, while others become active educational centers. The human stories that emerge when survivors return are often simple in form but dense in feeling. A man who once worked in a cold gallery will stand at the sealed mouth of stone and describe the way the air used to taste, the memory of a particular billet of wood they slept on, or the sound of boots on gravel in the dark. These fragments matter because they anchor archives to bodies. They are the counterweight to the dry language of engineering plans and inventory lists. They insist that technical ambitions cannot be separated from human cost. Here, the story begins to tighten around the tension at the heart of the title. Why did a man like Heinz, with professional options and options to retire from field inspection, continue to go back to these sealed places for decades? The straightforward documented answer lies partly in his official duties. The state assigns him to inspect, monitor, and report. He holds the authority and, critically, the responsibility to prevent a threefold harm. Prevent accidental entry that could kill civilians, prevent looting that would strip sites of historical artifacts, and keep an administrative record that preserves evidence of what these sites were. That administrative duty is a legal and technical reality.
But the administrative explanation does not exhaust the moral texture of his work. Within that administrative duty lies a practice of witness, to visit, to write down, to stand and see, especially when a man accompanied by no cameras or large crowds takes the time to do it, carries an ethical dimension. Even if his formal job description were to end, someone must, in a moral sense, be present to ensure that memory does not slide into neglect. This is where interpretation steps in. Historians, conservationists, and survivors often interpret the persistence of certain caretakers as acts of conscience. When pressed on the deepest reasons for staying, some such caretakers point to the victims, the names, the faces, the living relatives who come back, and to a belief that a site must be treated not only as an engineering problem, but as a moral responsibility. At the same time, the story cannot be told without recognizing concrete constraints. The institutions that commissioned inspections want continuity. Budget lines, legal liability, and the technical needs of environmental monitoring require long-term stewardship. The skills required to recognize subtle geological change are uneven among municipal teams. A trained geologist like Heinz brings a rare capacity to interpret millimeter movement as a sign of structural compromise rather than an isolated weather effect. That expertise makes him essential in practical terms. Yet there is another factor that is less easy to inventory: the personal rhythms that keep someone returning to a place. People who do hazardous, repetitive, and often thankless professional work sometimes describe a sense of vocation, the recognition that the job itself forms a bond between the living and the sites of the dead. For an appointed inspector, this can appear in a quiet professionalism. He performs annual checks regardless of weather. He keeps copies of old blueprints next to current readings. He brings survivors to supervised visits and learns their names. These acts are small in logistical scope, but weighty in moral consequence. Where records allow, we can point to documented meetings, to filed reports, and to photographed visits that support the idea that a caretaker's persistence is both procedural and ethical. Where records are silent, the motivation must be marked as interpretive rather than as a verbatim confession. To see this dynamic in practice, consider a documented inspection in the late 1990s of a sealed gallery near Neckarzimmern. Teams arrived with inspections. Heinz took readings, recorded the slight bulge on the western wall, and ordered a controlled monitoring schedule to see whether water infiltration would increase over the winter months. He also arranged a supervised visit for a small group of survivors and relatives, ensuring that their crossing of the site was accompanied by safety gear and that there would be attendants trained in first aid.
The archive shows photographs of the visit, a small group clustered around the sealed plug, an official log stamped and filed, a brief note requesting funding for additional monitoring equipment. These are the mundane pieces of the mosaic, technical measures interwoven with gestures of remembrance. The archive also contains moments that underline the risk inherent to negligence or absence. There are reports of unauthorized entries where scavengers removed metal and left structural linings weakened. There are municipal minutes describing an unexpected subsidence near a school, which triggered a hurried inspection. There are ordnance disposal reports cataloging the clearance of shells found among rubble. These incidents emphasize why the state keeps personnel assigned, and why, in a post-war Europe with shifting priorities, continuity of inspection can sometimes be the only thing preventing a secondary tragedy. But not all legal and practical arguments fully explain the existential tone of a life spent in the shadow of sealed galleries. There is a human quiet to stewardship that a technical inventory cannot fully capture. The sight of an old man tracing his finger along a ledger, where decades earlier names are recorded. The ceremonial manner in which an authorized supervisor turns a key to open a commemorative plaque. The private act of stepping aside while survivors touch the metal of a gate, and for a moment let memory do its work. These acts, when recorded in municipal files or in survivor accounts, acquire the weight of ritual, small, authorized rituals that reconstitute a relationship between a living person and a site of death. Yet the story remains incomplete when we stop at institution and ritual. The question in the title, Why He Never Left, demands more than a list of duties. It asks for an explanation that touches both the documented responsibilities and the morally inflected choices that make one man the visible custodian of many buried wrongs. In the materials available, the answer is not a single confession, but rather a constellation: official mandate, technical necessity, a sense of duty with moral overtones, and the practical need to prevent the erasure of material traces that would otherwise make remembering more difficult. Where the documentary record offers direct testimony from Heinz, those moments are presented verbatim and with care. Where it does not, historians and archivists construct interpretations grounded in the available evidence and explicitly label them as such. Our narrative here will therefore proceed on two tracks. First, a careful accumulation of the documented record, plans, reports, survivor testimony, and expert analysis that together explain what the sites were intended to do, how they were built, and how they were dealt with after the war.
Second, a cautious interpretive thread that takes the documented duties and the patterns of action by caretakers like Heinz and considers what these actions signify morally. That interpretive thread will be presented not as a dramatic confession, but as a reasoned hypothesis grounded in institutional practice and testimony. As the story moves from the technical and archival into the living present, into the dirt-streaked folders of municipal offices and the small, careful rituals of supervised visits, the tension grows. There are gaps in the records, sealed files whose content remains indefinito in public documentation, There are moments when the memory held in someone's gaze surpasses the language available in a bureaucratic report. Our task as narrators is to hold both the measurable facts and the moral weight of silence with equal respect. We return then to the scene above the sealed plug on the Bavarian slope. The concrete wears the weathered pockmarks of decades. A faint chalk line marks an inspection date from a year ago. Heinz arrives in a small van, his clipboard under his arm. He takes his instruments slowly, like someone who is both a professional and a custodian. He checks the ring, measures the microcracks, writes notes that will enter an official file. A local historian walks with him, carrying a map of the complex underground networks nearby. Later, a small group of municipal officials will cross-reference these notes with old construction plans conserved in an archive. A survivor's family will read the report and find traces of a place their relative once saw. Heinz will do this again in 5 years, and again in 5 years after that, unless the state changes policy or his mantle is passed to another expert. The act of returning is institutionalized, but it is made meaningful by a human continuity. That continuity does not offer a single sensational reason for why he never left. It offers instead a layered answer. He stayed because the state required it, because the geology demanded ongoing observation, because survivors and relatives sought a reliable steward, and because, in his own measured way, he accepted the ethical implications of guarding places where so many had suffered. There remains more to the story. There are technical reports to be examined in detail, testimonies still to be heard and placed in context, and the precise contours of Heinz's personal reflections, where they exist in the records, yet to be presented and tested against the archive. Before the full explanation that anchors the title can be delivered, the narrative must first untangle remaining threats, the particular histories of individual sites, the encounters between survivors and sites of memory, and the legal and environmental frameworks that shape how these places are treated today. Only after those threads are drawn into focus can a final account be assembled that honors both the facts and the moral gravity they carry.
In the next stretch of the story, we will go deeper into the gallery-level records, the blueprints and diaries, the survivor statements about daily life underground, and the technical post-war inspections that determined whether a plug would be permanent or periodically opened. We will examine case studies, a hall in Kala that was never completed, the V2 galleries at Mittelbau-Dora where production peaked and mortality was highest, the concrete domes along the northern coast, and we will trace how those specific places informed the duties of a caretaker like Heinz. We will also listen, where available, to his voice, the sentences he chose to share publicly, and those that remain a matter of interpretation in the archive. We begin at the scale of a single gallery and let the details do the work of translation. Blueprint lines become corridors, ledger entries become names. A note about ventilation failure becomes a remembered winter when men could not breathe. The first case is Kala, where the hollowed halls still look like the ribs of a giant beast. The plans for Kala show long, regular bays intended to receive ME-262 assemblies on jigs and rails. The drawings include annotations for power supply, compressed air systems, and an imagined choreography of parts and workmen that never stabilized into a functioning factory. Archaeological teams who studied the site in the post-war years found vaulted chambers with bolt patterns and anchor points for heavy tooling. They also found traces of ad hoc wartime expedients, wooden scaffolds bolted into soft sandstone, improvised supports where steel was scarce, and blast pattern scars that show how speed drove methods. Technically, Kala illustrates a common pattern, ambitious internal volume without the supporting infrastructure necessary for safe long-term use. Experts in tunneling note that such halls require either continuous maintenance or a robust lining to resist frost and water. Without that, seasonal cycles pry at seams and joints, iron corrodes, wooden props rot, and whole sections can detach in sheets. In Kala's case, the partial linings and exposed timber made later conservation work expensive and dangerous. The town ultimately decided to maintain the sealed plugs and restrict access, precisely because stabilizing the whole complex would have meant either heavy investment or a permanent intrusive presence on the local landscape. Mittelbau-Dora requires a different kind of attention because the sheer concentration of human suffering there transformed technical questions into legal and commemorative ones. The V2 galleries cut into the hearts are narrow in places and broad in others. They were adapted over months from storage caverns into assembly areas, and then, under the pressure of loss and movement of personnel, into places of improvisation.
Survivor accounts emphasize the rhythm of work, the movement of heavy components by hand, the insistence on quotas, the threat that a single misstep could result in immediate lethal punishment. These are hard facts in the record, guard rosters, prisoner lists, and liberation reports that together show high mortality and brutal conditions. The mechanical history of the A4 rocket, its pumps, guidance systems, and test benches, intersects with treatment histories, lists of workers, witness statements, and the forensic accounting of bodies and broken tools. Post-war investigators documented an array of physical traces at Mittelbau-Dora: rusted jigs, engine frames, and the imprints left where rails had been anchored. Yet they also documented the human artifacts that cannot be welded back together: hurried notes in the margins of work lists, personal scraps found in pockets, and the cataloging of names in camp registers. These registers became part of international war crimes documentation and later memorial archives. The persistence of the site in local memory, the return of former prisoners decades later, the small ceremonies at the edge of the quarry, turned the technical inspections into moral ones. A report from the 1950s shows American and British teams removing machinery and photographing workspaces. Subsequent German conservation files show municipal decisions to seal many galleries as a pragmatic public safety measure and as a way to contain the incomprehensible scale of loss. Neckar-Zimmern, with its roughly 34 kilometers of carved galleries, functions as a different kind of case study. Scale. Carving tens of kilometers of sandstone is an engineering feat only if one removes the human cost from the equation. When the full Niger is tallied, the labor that carved those kilometers reads like a human pipeline. Local files show how the excavation process unfolded: mass blasting crews working in shifts, the use of prisoner labor for hauling spoil, and the repetitive pattern of hand tools and small explosives that left a characteristic web of hairline splitting in the rock. Geotechnical follow-ups decades later turned up a familiar set of problems: microfractures following the line of blast faces, water channels that had established new paths, and pockets of unconsolidated spoil that could shift unpredictably. Those are the sorts of things a geologist like Heinz must watch for. They are subtle, measurable, and potentially catastrophic if not monitored. Along the northern coast, the domes at Watton and the enormous hemispheres at Wizarens, La Coupole, show another face of the subterranean program: sheer material ambition. The concrete shells there were intended as hardened spaces for storage, and in some plans for the assembly or concealment of launch infrastructure. Allied reconnaissance and bombing campaigns degraded some of these plans into large hollowed-out monuments.
Post-war engineers who inspected these structures found compromised reinforcement, hairline fractures in the domes, and drainage problems that incurred internal humidity and spalling at the outer faces. For local communities, these concrete giants are visual scars, and for conservators, they are expensive liabilities. Where possible, authorities preserved them as educational sites. Where not possible, they were left to the elements and to a slow process of decay that nevertheless requires periodic professional attention. Falkenhagen's partial construction for sarin manufacture is a particularly painful document in the archive. Records are fragmentary in places. Where the paper trail grows thin, the files are labeled indefinido, or annotated as restricted. What is clear, and repeatedly emphasized by cautious historians, is that the intent to move chemical weapon production underground reflects a set of decisions that increase moral culpability: concealment, protection from interdiction, and the deliberate protection of programs designed to kill indiscriminately. The technical traces are sparse, the legal and ethical traces are dense. Environmental monitoring of sites like Falkenhagen is not simply a matter of structural safety, but also of chemical residue. Specialist teams have taken soil cores and run analyses. Those studies sometimes find low-level contamination, industrial remnants, and precursor chemicals that must be handled under strict protocols. This is not the stuff of rumor, it is the domain of environmental forensics. Across these sites, three practical hazards recur and shape a caretaker's daily practice. The first is structural instability, the slow, measurable creep of sandstone, and the sudden risk of delamination where blast planes meet natural bedding planes. The second is ordnance, forgotten shells and components that remain live and that can detonate if disturbed. The third is contamination, oil, solvents, and in rare cases chemical residues, which require monitoring and sometimes remediation. The work of inspection is designed to identify these hazards early and to ensure that the public and the memory of the victims are not compromised by secondary accidents. Heinz's methods are at once modern and mundane. He uses laser profilers to map fracture lines, portable gas analyzers to test for volatile compounds, and bathymetric-like measurements where groundwater has incised new paths. He cross-references his readings with old wartime blueprints. A bolt pattern on a wall might correspond to an anchor that once held a heavy press, which in turn explains the presence of a particular type of spoil heap outside the plug. The skill is both observational and archival. This is not the work of a single man theatrically holding a key. It is the accumulation of years of measured observations filed into a bureaucratic system that persists beyond any one person's lifetime.
But technical work alone cannot explain the ritual of supervised survivor visits. These visits, when allowed, are planned with medical support, protective gear, and restricted routes. Survivors who returned decades later often described the experience not as a retrieval of facts, but as a site of moral reckoning, a place where memory and official documentation meet. Municipal records show how such visits are organized: a petition, a risk assessment, an agreement on the route, and then a formal registration in a ledger that marks the event. For a town, a supervised visit is an administrative act and a public acknowledgement. For a caretaker, facilitating it is part of stewardship. For survivors, it is an opportunity to place a living human presence at the seam where the administrative record and lived suffering converge. The archive preserves small but telling incidents that underline the stakes of continued attention. In the late 1970s, municipal minutes record an unauthorized entry at a small sealed site where scavengers removed iron rails. A short time later, a monitored survey found a weakened arch and a small subsidence above a former spoil heap. In another town, a child wandered into an unsecured vent and was rescued by quick municipal action. The incident prompted a renewed funding request for additional fencing. Bomb disposal units, called in at several sites, cataloged shells and components that could still be active, and their reports warn in procedural language of the dangers of amateur intervention. These incidents feed directly into policy. Funding lines shift, permit regimes tighten, and the practical weight of a caretaker's job grows heavier. The pattern of continuity is therefore administrative, technical, and moral, woven together. When we ask why Heinz continued to return, it is useful to hold these threads together as evidence. Officially, he had a mandate: periodic inspections, reporting duties, and the legal authority to request remedial action when thresholds of risk were reached. Practically, his skills made him indispensable: the ability to interpret micromovements, to design a monitoring schedule, and to liaise with multidisciplinary teams is not widely available in a small municipal workforce. Morally, the work put him at the hinge between forgetting and remembering. His reports could be used by historians, by memorial organizations, and by legal teams if questions of responsibility resurged. Practically, without his continuity, a town might lose the institutional memory necessary to respond to emerging hazards. At the same time, interpretation is required to speak to the personal intensity of such commitment. The records give evidence of actions, visits, reports, supervised ceremonies. These are documented. They do not, however, always provide a full transcript of internal motive.
Where Heinz's own words are present in files and public interviews, we present them directly. Where he has not left an explicit, sustained personal confession, we must mark additional claims as interpretation. Using the available documentation, a careful synthesis can be made: that he continued because the state required it, because technical continuity demanded it, because survivors and families sought an accountable steward, and because, in practice, the act of returning carried ethical weight. This is not a singular psychological portrait, but a constellation of institutional duties, professional ethics, and the human habit of attending to sites that resist being left alone. There is, too, the question of symbolic continuity. When a named individual maintains an inspection schedule for decades, that person becomes a public signifier, a reminder that the past is not inert, that the moral imperative to remember can be operationalized through continuous, if quiet, work. Where municipalities document ritual gestures, formally noting a survivor's visit, maintaining a ledger of inspection dates, or preserving an old key as part of an archive, the caretaker's job encodes memory into administrative practice. The significance is not merely sentimental, it is evidentiary. A preserved report or photograph can later serve as corroboration in historical accounts, or as a basis for memorial exhibits. Two episodes underscore the complex mix of duty and witness. In one, an inspection log from the early 1990s shows Heinz requesting additional monitoring equipment after detecting repeated incremental movements in a sandstone plug. His request was approved and a small grant allocated. 3 years later, a controlled reinforcement reduced the risk of collapse. The sequence is technical: measurement, equipment, remediation. It is also moral: a series of decisions and approvals that protected a site from becoming a hazard and preserved its material traces for future interpretation. In another documented incident, Heinz coordinated with a wartime survivor who wanted to see the sealed mouth of a gallery one last time. The visit was supervised, brief, and instrumented. Medical personnel accompanied the group, and the survivor's testimony was recorded and archived. That record now sits in a municipal file, a small, formal paper trail that links a living voice to a sealed place. Two caveats are necessary here. First, where a file or a historian's note uses the term indefinito, it marks the boundary of public knowledge: classified archives, missing documents, and redacted lines that cannot be safely or responsibly reconstructed. Second, the narrative must resist the temptation to collapse professional duty into a romanticized tale of solitary heroism.
Heinz's role is significant precisely because it reflects institutional decisions and a distributed network of responsibility.
The idea of a single man never leaving must be read against that institutional background. He is both an individual actor and a node in a larger system. So what, finally, does the record permit us to say about the title's promise? The answer must be layered. On the level of fact, Heinz was appointed, maintained an inspection schedule, and produced reports that were filed and consulted by municipal and memorial bodies. Those are documented actions, and they form the baseline for any explanation. On the level of necessity, his continued presence made sense. The geology required monitoring, unexploded ordnance posed ongoing hazards, and survivors' needs for supervised visits demanded trustworthy stewardship. Those are practical reasons supported by records and expert testimony. On a moral level, interpretation, grounded in the pattern of his actions, in the ritual of supervised visits, and in his coordination with memorial groups, suggests that stewardship carried ethical weight for him. That interpretation is consistent with the archive, but must be presented as interpretive rather than as a verbatim confession, unless a direct quote exists. If there is a single sentence that captures the way the record frames his commitment, it is this: his work was both the application of expertise to prevent further harm and an embodied practice of remembrance. The phrase, "he never left," is therefore less about a single man refusing departure out of private obsession and more about the persistence of institutional, technical, and moral duty in the face of sites that refuse to be forgotten. Where individuals, survivors, historians, municipal officials described him as a steward or a keeper, they did so because his actions created and maintained an archival and physical continuity between the wartime past and a living present that still had to reckon with its consequences. There are unanswered questions. Some files remain sealed, some technical readings are only sporadically available, and parts of the record remain indefinitive. But the material we can see is enough to support a careful conclusion. He stayed because the work required continuity, because his expertise was scarce and consequential, and because in practice, maintaining these places is a form of witness. That witness is not theatrical. It is written in ledgers, photographed in municipal files, and enacted in the small administrative ceremonies that bring survivors back to the edge of a sealed mouth and let them, for a moment, mark what was taken. In the end, the concrete plug on the Bavarian slope is both a literal seal and a metaphor. It keeps the Earth's wounds closed, but it also keeps open a line of responsibility. A man who opens folders, measures microcracks, and organizes supervised returns does more than check boxes. He joins a network of scholars, of survivors, of municipal custodians that insists those wounds not be smoothed over by convenience or neglect.
The moral of this account is not neat. It refuses a tidy heroism and avoids an apolitical technocratic rhetoric. Instead, it offers a practical, documented explanation: continuity of duty, scarcity of expertise, and a moral practice of custodianship that together explain why a government-designated geologist like Heinz returned and kept returning to sealed mouths of stone. That is the explanation the record allows us to give: detailed, sober, and bounded by what the archives disclose and by what remains indefinito. These places remain active edges of memory. They will need monitoring long after any single individual retires. Their preservation, their study, and their commemoration require funding, professional attention, and the political will to prioritize remembrance alongside reconstruction. If this story prompts a response, let it be practical. Support memorial institutions, consult reputable archives, and trust trained teams to handle hazards. The past demands measures that are at once technical and ethical. If you want to learn more about the specific archives, survivor testimonies, and conservation efforts referenced in this film, you'll find curated links in the description to memorial foundations and research groups working on these sites. Standing above that concrete plug once more, one sees how small gestures add up: a logged inspection, a supervised visit, a filed photograph. The slab of concrete does what it was designed to do. It seals a space. But it cannot seal the responsibility that follows. The last caretakers, the survivors, and the recorded documents together keep an open doorway between then and now. Their labor is not dramatic. It is steady. That steadiness is our clearest answer to the title's question. He never left because leaving would have been neglect, and neglect in these places carries consequences that extend beyond the weathering of rock. To guard a sealed gallery is to guard a truth. In honoring that truth, consider visiting reputable memorials, supporting institutions that preserve testimony, and consulting the primary sources that hold these narratives. The links in the description point to organizations and archives where you can begin.